Oh, and there's our recording. The session this afternoon is explaining the why, AI student motivation in academic writing. Laura Hill from the Department of Italian, Andy Wilson from Uni High, and I will turn it over to Laura.
Thank you, Jim. Now, when we teach languages on this campus, many departments like mine stress the importance of writing from the very beginning of instruction as a way to develop language proficiency. So there is a lot of concern now that our students are not engaging in writing. They are simply feeding the topic into AI. And what we see are unrealistic submissions that are reflective of this sad situation. So there is a lot of concern among my colleagues, not only the ones like myself who teach beginning and intermediate, but also at a more advanced level about losing the important contribution that writing offers when learning a language. So what can we do about AI and writing in our courses? The way I see it, there are three possible scenarios that are open to us. And unfortunately, none of them is perfect, offers a perfect solution. They all present certain risks. The first possibility is simply embracing AI, accepting the fact that AI is here, it's here to stay, our students will use it, even beginning students. Now, if we take this route, as we will see, there are some risks that you can already imagine. But an alternative is to exclude AI, to tell our students that they're not allowed to use AI at all when submitting, for example, a discussion post or a composition or writing assignment. And this is what we have been doing the last few years, except we quickly realized that that doesn't work. And we will see what the risks are in that case too. But there is a third possibility, which may seem a little bit idealistic and far-fetched. It also has its risks, and it's to get students on board. To get them involved in the decision of where and when and if to use AI in their writing assignments. So let's look a little bit at the negatives in the three scenarios. Embracing AI. So the main risk is to create a dependency. Our students from the very beginning get into the habit of not putting in the effort to combine the linguistic elements to create their own writing. And as they advance semester after semester, we notice that they cannot do without AI. When there is an exam, for example, the level of the writing is abysmal because we have created this or allowed the creation of this dependency. So there is clearly an interference with their learning or what their learning potential would be. On the other hand, if we totally exclude AI, there are also negatives and risks. We basically create a bubble. We pretend, that's what we used to do. We pretend that AI can be left out of the game. And once we put in our syllabus that AI is not allowed, our job is done. But it's not as simple as that. And also, if we exclude AI and we want to be really thorough, then we would need to act as the police, to police the classroom, to call out those students who use AI and possibly refer them for discipline with the college. And that is a route that some of our colleagues are following, have followed. It's very complicated, it's stressful, for both, not only for the student going through the disciplinary process, but also for the instructor. And more importantly, it creates a hostile environment in the classroom. So then we have the third option, which is to get the students on board, involved in the decision. In this case, we lose control. We don't have the control that we had in option 2 because we share that control, basically. We choose to share it with students. And so in the best case scenario, what we can aspire at is partial success. We will get a certain number of students to realize why it's not a good idea to use AI, especially at the beginning level. I'm not saying that AI doesn't have a role in learning languages, certainly can have a role, even in writing, but at the very beginning level, it can have this disruptive effect. If we get the students to make their own decisions, we already should know that it's not going to be 100% of them on board not using AI. So as I was trying to figure out which way to follow, I didn't believe in number 2 anymore. I wasn't quite ready to embrace it, number 1. So I was considering the possibility of the third scenario. And I thought it would be interesting to see what students think of AI themselves. And I found some useful information in Inside Higher Education. A few months ago, Inside Higher Education published the results of a student survey. It's not scientifically perfect by any means. The sample of students interviewed is relatively limited. It's over 1,000 students, but with a certain variety. 2- and 4-year institutions, some of them public, some of them private. The survey included both undergraduate and graduate students. And so a series of questions were asked. The first question is, how are you using AI? And we can see that they answer in a variety of ways. But what interested me the most was that about 20% admitted to using it for writing free responses or essays using AI. So this is something that is already worrisome to me. Then students were asked why. And the word used in the survey, in the question, was cheating. So unauthorized use of AI. And you see in different colors the distinction between the undergraduate students in blue and the graduate students in orange. And the responses that I found the most interesting were good grades. So a number of students admitted to using AI in an unauthorized way to get good grades, or because they didn't have enough time, or so they said. But even more interesting to me was that they thought there were not clear policies on the use of AI. So they weren't quite sure what was cheating, what was not. And these policies ideally should come from their instructors, from their professors. So maybe if we could work on that idea, we could come to a more realistic solution. And then the larger issue of integrity, what did the students think about safeguarding integrity? How can that be done? And here in different colors, you find public versus private, but the answers are not very different. So again, the best way would be to create clear and standardized policies, to have clear policies that would help definitely to protect integrity. And then putting in an effort to educate students on the use of AI. But a certain number of them also thought that it would be positive to allow a certain flexibility, as long as students are transparent about it. So claiming the willingness to make the decision by themselves with a clear statement of when they used AI. And then the other flip of the coin, what did these students think about their instructors using AI? Were they in favor of it? What did they think? And it's interesting to see that the same split that we noticed among instructors in favor and against students using AI can be found in students thinking about their instructors using AI. So as you can see, the largest percentage are somewhat negative and somewhat positive. So instructor using AI could pose a concern about the quality of instruction or over-reliance of instructors on using AI. But on the other hand, if used thoughtfully and transparently, then they think that some good could come from instructors using AI. And here, do you think that AI helps you learn? And again, it's very interesting to see this mid-range that of the graph that shows the highest percentages. Most students thought that the outcome would be mixed. The use of AI could help, but it could also make them think less deeply. So we can see that the way students think about AI is not that radically different from ours. And finally, how should the university prepare you for the use of AI? Again, a stress on training, clear instructional guidance, and a suggestion, creating a course or module on AI literacy. So after some thinking of my own, I chose my path for the foreseeable future. And these are my guiding principles. Communication, so explaining to students the rationale why we do not recommend or we discourage the use of AI in our Italian language courses. Sharing with them the goals. So what are the goals? A syllabus usually indicates the goals, but we can be more specific. We can tell students how, for example, writing is conducive to those goals and why writing is so important in our teaching methodology. So this enhances also our transparency with students. And we can provide a model of how to ethically use AI whenever we do, declare it, making it clear, and being always there available for guidance and feedback. So basically, I think that cooperation rather than enforcement is worth giving it a try at this point. Among other things, the benefit is that if we are not the police, we save instructional time. And if there are problems with the unauthorized use of AI, then they could be addressed in a non-confrontational way that doesn't involve the disciplinary channels. So as a result of all this, I've been creating a mandatory introductory module that will be required of all our Italian students already this fall at the beginning and intermediate level. And the module follows a path from the more general to the more specific. One problem we have with languages is that sometimes students see the language requirement as just a burden. So I thought that in this transparency effort, it was also useful to clarify why the language requirement can be seen as an opportunity instead. And this all starts with gen ed courses. So the module starts with a brief explanation of the benefits that all students can derive from gen ed courses, not just the ones who are still undecided about their future profession. And then more specific, the role of the language requirement, seen as an opportunity, especially today in a global environment. Then the even more specific, why writing is fundamental in learning a language. And so writing assignments, being presented to students, not just like a chore, but like a tool to advance. And finally, the negative effects that the use of AI, unauthorized use of AI, can have on the learning of the language, creating over-reliance and a dependency. So the final outcome, ideally, should be this, as visualized by AI, or this is my hope. So we'll start the experiment with the new module. I'm realistic. I know that it won't be persuasive to all students, but I see this as the best way to go at this point. And now I know that Andy has a lot to say, to add to what I just said.
The cast. I want to extend my screen. What's the Windows? Is it?
Okay.
That's the one I just. Yeah, that's right. I'll figure it out here. Let's do. Display settings. Sorry. Oops. How do I do my? Trying to get my display. I just wanted to extend my display.
Should be one of the hotkeys at the top.
That's what I
Yeah,
thought.
that one.
There we go. Thank
Yeah.
you. There we go.
Yeah.
That's what I wanted. Thanks for sitting with me while we accidentally looked up Diddy there. That's what we all want to start our day with. All right. Oops. All right. So, I'm gonna actually build off a lot of what Laura was just talking about in her presentation, kind of exploring like this issue of communication, right? So we are going to talk about like how do we get our students essentially on board with one of these modules? How do we communicate the importance of what we do, of what we are trying to accomplish in our classes, and why they should kind of go along with our policies, why they should either, if we decide to go down path one that Laura lays out of saying, you know, whatever, go wild. I don't think we have to do a lot of buy-in to get them to go wild with AI. That seems to be what they just naturally want to do. If we're going to police it, or if we're trying to build some buy-in on a certain kind of more nuanced approach to AI, these are some of the things that we should consider. And so I am a social studies teacher at Uni High. So I work with sophomores, 10th graders, 11th graders, and 12th graders over at the high school. I also work with pre-service teachers in the College of Ed, in the teaching experiences group. So I get to really work with from 16 to 22 in terms of age and varied educational levels here. So I'm going to talk today about like this module, what I do in my classrooms. Essentially, how do I get a bunch of 15 and 16-year-olds who are really working on kind of foundational educational concepts. I mean, we are working on like, how do you take notes? How do you summarize a text? How do you write something extremely basic like a 5-paragraph essay, right? How do we construct an argument? These are essential skills that they are then going to come and bring to you all when you ask them to write these things. And so if they are offloading that work, right, to AI, they're going to come to you all woefully like inexperienced and incapable of doing the things you all are going to ask them to, right? So if you aren't getting these skills at my level, you're going to run into these things that Laura highlighted, right? Where they are going to be dependent and unable to do that. So how do we get them to flex these muscles, right? How do we get them to do this hard work and engage? And really what I'm going to argue is we need to really work on getting buy-in, right? Connecting the why, connecting with the students on like why this is important to them, why they should engage in this kind of work, and communicating that really clearly with them. All right. So first we're going to talk about like cognitive offload versus cognitive surrender, right? And cognitive offload, we're going to start with the typo in here, tool, it should be tool or crutch. When we engage in these conversations, right, we're going to ask our students to oftentimes think of these AI applications as tools, right? If you're going to have them use it, say this is a tool, this should supplement the kind of thinking that you're going to do, right? We have all sorts of cognitive offloading tools that we use in our daily lives. We use calculators for various things. I mean, I have a notebook. I write notes down in my notebook. I have a calendar to keep track of things. These are cognitive offloading practices that make it so I don't have to manage all of this stuff in my brain. It frees up some space, right? And there's this idea there that there's wasteful friction. There are tedious, difficult tasks that are just mundane and like take up time and they take up space from a thing. That's where we can think of like some positive aspects of cognitive offloading. It's not always a bad thing. I think it often gets this like very negative kind of rap of being like, oh, students are engaged in cognitive offloading, this is terrible, right? Like they're having the AI do their work. Really, the thing that we are the most concerned about is this other concept, cognitive surrender, right? That's the one where they are just saying, hey, ChatGPT, Gemini, Claude, whatever, I have this prompt. Can you answer this prompt for me? They just get the feedback from the AI and then they just turn that in, right? Like that's the kind of most blatant, obvious example of cognitive surrender, where they just completely give over all of their agency to the AI. They just say, whatever, I'm going to lay back, right? Surrender. Here you go, robot. Please do this for me. And so we kind of have to like navigate these concepts, right? How do we conceptualize this tool versus a crutch? How do we think about cognitive offloading versus cognitive surrender, right? And we all want them to engage in, if we are incorporating AI, we would really like to be the most positive kind of cognitive offloading concept, right? We want them to use it as a tool that supplements their learning, that supports the skills that they already have, that's going to help them engage in kind of the heavy lifting, the hard work that we're going to ask them to do, right? And ultimately what we're going to get to is a couple of like metaphors that we might use, right? Like we might want them to think about this like gym or junk food comparison, right? Like I oftentimes talk to my students about like, well, you wouldn't send your robot to the gym, right? And have it go lift weights or run on the treadmill and then expect your body to get like all jacked and strong, right? Like, no, that's not how that's going to work, right? You need to go to the gym and do the hard work. So there's this positive kind of connotation. You need to go and do this behavior, do this thing, develop this habit that is hard, right? But the flip side of that is this junk food metaphor, right? Like, if I'm going to be physically healthy, I'm not going to eat all of this, take in all of this bad food and expect my body to run well, right? So again, if I'm engaged in if I'm using AI and I'm having it do all of the work for me, I'm having it do all of this thinking, I'm going to become dependent on it. I'm going to run into this same thing that Laura highlighted, where I have kind of taken this thing on and I have all of these negative connotations now. Now I'm ruining my own ability to think. I can't think. I have to have the AI help me out, right? So I engage in this kind of like positive, negative push and pull. I need to like both send my body to the gym and I need to not eat junk food, right? I need to both do the hard work of learning and not offload my thinking to the AI, right? And so these are both important concepts, right? And so these are the kinds of things that I'm trying to like communicate to my students. And these things are complicated, right? These are complicated concepts to try to like get across. The metaphor, I think, helps a little bit with the gym and the junk food thing, but like ultimately, a lot of times we communicate to our students, hey, I have this like, this policy. These are the things I want you to do in this class. You kind of need to sort it out individual student. You need to figure out when you are engaging in either cognitive offloading or cognitive surrender. That's hard for a 15, 16-year-old to engage in. That's hard for an undergrad to engage in. I talked to my pre-service teachers about this and they're like, yeah, I don't know. Like if I'm going to create a, lesson plan, it's very easy to have the AI create a lesson plan. It saves me a lot of time. It saves me a lot of work. And like, it seems mundane, right? It seems like a tedious task that I don't want to engage in. But I'm like, but that's how you like understand the core components of your lesson. These are these foundational skills, right? Like writing a 5-paragraph essay or putting together your lesson plan. These are things you've got to know how to do because ultimately what you need to be able to do is engage in some kind of critical analysis of that stuff, right? And you won't know that if you don't do the hard work. So I'm engaging in this conversation. There's a lot of ambiguity. Again, students don't know when they are or are not engaging in cognitive offload or surrender. And so this, I'll talk about in a little bit. This gets to this place of communication where it's really important to communicate. What are your expectations around certain skills, right? Like, what do you want the students to do in this class? What are the hard things that you think they might do? And it might be that like there is some like wasteful or kind of repetitive things that you think you need to know how to do this. This is an important thing for you to develop this knowledge base, right? But you can't just kind of assume that they will go through that process without explicit kind of direction and communication to them that like, this is valuable. I think this is something you need to do. It's also really important to take a step back and think about like, you are the expert on this thing. You know this really well. So you know the places really well where you're engaging in cognitive offload versus cognitive surrender. You know, as somebody who really understands their field, where that line is. An undergrad or like a high school student, they don't have that level of expertise. They don't have that knowledge. They are not able to kind of gauge and assess that. So again, being really cognizant of like where they are with their ability and being really clear, like, yeah, like I might have this do some analysis of like some sources for me, but like you need to do the hard work of like reading through the sources and taking notes on this thing. Finally, we have to be really clear, as Laura pointed out with that survey, about the kind of social pressure. I run into this a lot. I see this both with my pre-service teachers, but also with my high school students. They are looking at what their peers are doing. They see them use AI or a perception that other people are using AI. It's not even necessarily clear. They just assume, right, that everybody else is using AI and getting away with it. And so it's kind of this arms race that's going on everywhere of like, well, if I don't engage in it, if I don't use AI, if I don't supplement my work with this, I'm going to get behind everybody else, right? And both for like my high school students and the college students I work with, the end product, the end goal is either getting into a good college or getting a job. And both of those things are really, really uncertain right now, right? Like it is an ambiguous and difficult time to both be a student trying to like move up the kind of academic ladder or to go out into the job market, right? It's scary out there. And so there's a lot of pressure. There's a kind of social, cultural pressure for them to like engage in these things. And so being aware of all of these concepts and thinking about them as you are like engaging in course design are like really, really important. Oh, and this is just a study about how much surrender students engage in. It's a bummer if you want to read it. So I really needed, as I'm putting together my source, I'm always thinking about like connecting the why. How do we connect the students to this important work that we want them to do? And first of all, I often ground this in backwards design. I think about what are my values? What do I want the students to get out of this course? And then how do I build the course from that, right? So that's where I, started to think about in the past year, actually the last 2 years, how do I develop a course? How do I work on building in these concepts in a way that is really meaningful to my students? It builds in a meaningful rationale for my students. And this is really just like a clear connection, as Laura was talking about, having a clear connection to what your goals are and what are the skills and what are the values that you want to model in your class. I oftentimes give my students this kind of contextual piece, why it's important. Again, they are really keyed into like skills. What are the skills that they need to get right? What are the things that they need to know to be able to go out and go on to the next level, either to go be a high school teacher or to go be a successful college student, right? And so I'm always communicating to my students, okay, what are these skills? If you want to be successful in college, you're going to need to be able to understand a text. You're going to need to be able to take notes. You're going to be able to have to know how to write a 5-paragraph essay. That's important. If you're going to be a teacher, you need to know how to put together a lesson plan, right? These are basic things, but you got to do them. You have to practice them in order to understand them. There might be an AI. AI could do all of these things for you, but you won't know, right, if it's doing it well if you don't know how to do it yourself. I also, try and explain why it's relevant, right? And that's connected to these skills, but it's also connected to this bigger picture. I talk a lot to my students, especially the high school students, about like being a member of society, being a citizen of this country, being somebody who is engaged in this social project with the rest of us, right? Like, so if you're not going and doing this hard work, I'm always like, I'm going to be an old man someday. I need you to be functional and be able to take care of me. Like, help me out here, right? So trying to make these things relevant to them is really key. And I also engage in these metacognitive conversations. Honestly, these are often the most like impactful for the students. And this is where I talk to them about like the junk food. These are the negative consequences of you using AI. I have them read the MIT study that came out like a year ago where they like looked at like the impact, the cognitive impact of using AI on students. And I talked to them about like what are the really key and important reasons for doing this hard work. So I have these kinds of two conversations. And how does this look in my course? Oh, these are also additional concepts that I talk about in my world history class. And they're based on this study, A New Direction for Students in AI, developed by these researchers at the Brookings Institute. I don't know if anybody's familiar with Rebecca Winthrop. She writes and talks about this stuff quite a bit. And so in my world history class, I actually kind of cribbed these concepts as the foundational pieces of a module that I've been running for the last year in my course, where I'm basically trying to get the students on board with these policies that I'm putting out there. And it's grounded in these concepts. And so I want my students to think, to be civically minded. I want them to think broadly about like the philosophical ideas behind these things. And I want them to engage in AI literacy. They need to know when it is okay and when it is not okay to use these tools. Again, as Laura pointed out, our talks worked really well together. When you just say, when you give them carte blanche and let them run wild, right? They're just going to offload most of their thinking to the AI. But if you're policing and you're locking, really being rigid with your policies, then they don't really understand how to interact with it in a productive way, right? So you need to find this like space where you, as the instructor, are okay with them using AI or not using AI. And that's, again, connected with like communication with the students. So what I did for the first 4 weeks of my class, and again, because I teach at Uni High, my courses are a year long. And so I have, a much larger runway to work on these things. So I created a 4-week unit, which is essentially all buy-in. It's all connecting the why, explaining to my students, this is why this is important. This is why you should do the hard work. And this is why you really need to like engage in this process honestly. And I put, real clear expectations around AI, what they would and would not use. I policed it because I'm working with high school students. I policed it a little bit more than I would if I was just working with my pre-service teachers. I would have them, essentially, I created like a Blue Book Google Doc that they would just write in that. And so I could see where all their work was at. But beyond that, it was flexible. They could research, they could use the AI to help them find sources and find materials for these different units. But I had clear expectations. I clearly communicated what my objectives were at the beginning of the class, and then for each subsequent unit, I communicated that as well. And so this unit that I had is kind of a meta unit on like why learning is important, and I tied each of the themes, each theme of the course to this unit. So in my course, it's a world history course, but we talk about democracy because Illinois has a requirement. You have to have a civics requirement. You also have an economics requirement. And then I do the religion part, philosophy. So we talked about, why education is important to be, a member of a democracy, right? We also, to tie it to the importance of like the very practical skills-based thing, we talked about like, okay, you would like to have a job someday. This is what the economy is like, and here's why it's important for you to do this work. You also want to be a fulfilled and happy person, right? So here's why it's important to like engage in like honest and ethical learning to be a virtuous, happy person in a society. At the end of the unit, they reflected. They wrote a reflection. They connected the concepts that we talked about in the unit to their own personal values, and they reflected on that. They wrote about that. And then they worked on integrating that into the remaining work. So I kept coming back to these every unit, every assignment, coming back to like, well, this is how this connects to like that earlier bit about education. And I was really pleased. One of my like proud teacher moments of the year was we had gotten all the way. I did this in August. We are in mid-April and we are talking about fascism, the Soviet Union. And one of my students made this connection to the initial unit talking about like why it's important to like engage in like critical thinking with like the Soviet purges in the 1920s and 30s. And I was just like, oh, tear almost ran down my cheek. I was so happy about that. It does not happen very often. But kind of constantly coming back, reinforcing this messaging around like, look, like we are talking about history, we are talking about these things in the past, but this is how this is, again, relevant to you and what you're doing. So I've been surveying my students on this for the last few years after kind of just being like, we're not going to even think about it for a while. And so in 2025, I asked them at the end of the spring semester, I said, how many of you used AI at any point, like on these projects during the course of the year? I had 62% of them say yes. And so out of those 62, and we can assume that like these are the students who would self-reported honestly on this survey. The number is actually probably much higher, right? And so 62 said yes. And I asked them, how did they use it? Most of them were like, oh, I just had it find sources for me. I had it format things, kind of like more mundane excuses. But I had probably half of them say, I had it do most of my writing for me. I had it come up with my arguments. I had it do really the hard thinking for me. And that killed me a little bit. And so that's when I was like, all right, we got to really like take this seriously. So in this past year is when I first tried out this new module. I really made a concerted effort to like explain this, connect the why, really engage with the students. And it, cut it in half, at least on the reporting, right? And at the end of the semester, when the students were coming and telling me, they filled out this anonymous survey again, 29% of them said yes. The bummer is that those 29%, almost all of them gave a full-throated justification for why they needed AI, like why they had to use it on this assignment. I know you told me not to, but you, Dr. Wilson, don't know what you're talking about. I had to use this AI. You do not understand, right? I was just like, oh man, this is like such an interesting psychological like endeavor we are engaging in here. So from my like modest data that I have here, that certainly has a lot of flaws with it. It seems like, really trying to sell the why, connecting the why is really important, regardless of the level of like restriction or not restriction you engage in. We have to just be engaging in these conversations now at a baseline. The students are going to go out, whether if we do option one that Laura put out, or option two, and we are policing everything, students are going to go outside of class and they're going to use it in these spaces where we are not supervising them anymore, right? The days of assigning an essay and them going and doing it, and the only way they could offload that to somebody else is paying somebody to do it. Those days are gone because it's very easy to go to ChatGPT or Claude or whoever and have them do this. So now we really, really, really have to sell to our students, convince them that like, this is important. This is a valuable thing. Now, as my data shows, you're not going to get everybody, but I'm pretty happy that I at least like cut it in half. So, yeah, I'm pretty convinced that, you really do need to like engage in a lot of this buy-in. You really have to sell your students on like, this is why this is relevant to you and connect it. And this is just, I think, generally good teaching practice anyway. But I think it is absolutely essential today. All right, cool. Thank you.
Any questions for Andy and Laura?
Oh, back.
I love the way you ended, which was that isn't it, or that it is the, best teaching practices anyway. So did you find that really engaging with why they have to learn this versus that actually did make you a better teacher by rethinking again, which part can we actually legitimately just cut out and which ones are the essence?
Yeah, because it forces you to really, move, because I think there's a certain level of inertia, right, with teaching where you just like, I've done this way for a while. These are the materials that I have. This is the systems that I have set up. And it's easy to just kind of continue with the flow of that. It's good. It's good, right? To like be reevaluating your teaching practices and why you do these things. And I feel like, yeah, coming back to this and evaluating it from this perspective really allowed me to like kind of reprioritize on like the things I valued in the class, and it made me
reinvigorated it.
Yeah, I think so. I think it made it a much better course. Yeah. So yeah, it was a good process to go through. It was very stressful. It was a lot of work, right? I had to like kind of configure everything to kind of account for AI, but I think ultimately it was a good pedagogical practice to engage in. Yeah. Yeah.
This is also for Laura, and for both of you. Okay, so you work at Uni High, and I'm just curious, and you work in the French and Italian. How much are your other colleagues doing sort of similar things so that these kinds of discussions are happening, not just, in his classroom or her classroom, but everybody's sort of giving a similar message. And of course, we have academic freedom. We can, teach basically. We don't have to teach exactly the way our colleagues do. But I guess what I'm asking is, do you see a value for like a broad-based policy within an institution or within a department? Or how do you see like AI discussions and this buy-in that you talk about being sort of a departmental or maybe a school-wide discussion?
Well, I think a lot depends on the discipline. There are certainly disciplines in which the use of AI can be accepted and encouraged much more broadly, where in other disciplines it's more problematic. So I don't see it as much as a unified campus-wide response. And even within a department, there are different course levels in which the use of AI can be more or less acceptable. So if we want general statements, I think they have to be very general at the departmental or at the university level, and refer then to the specific level of instruction for more specific guidance. Yeah. Now, in my case, what I am implementing is going to affect a level of instruction that my colleagues teaching advanced courses may not be in total agreement with. And people teaching different disciplines may strongly disagree with. And I think that in general, right now, there is a sense of disorientment, waiting for something to happen and to come from above. But I'm afraid that is not going to happen. We need to take the lead in our own domain and let others make their own choices with a certain level of coordination, but pretty loose, I would say.
Yeah, it seemed like for a long time people were waiting for the Turnitin of AI to come along and kind of take the burden off of our shoulders and just be like, oh, cool, I can just throw this, whatever this work is, through the AI checker and it would do it. And that never happened, and it probably isn't going to happen. And so we need to find these spaces, and to be flexible. And I think Laura's exactly right. Like being able to, as best as you can, coordinate with your colleagues. I mean, I'm at Uni High, so I have 4 other teachers in my department that I work with, and so it's easy for us to coordinate and get on the same page. And we largely, it probably would not surprise anybody, but the social studies department and the English department are largely on the same page because of our pedagogical backgrounds. You know, we do a lot of reading and we do a lot of writing. And so we all basically have very similar approaches to this, but our approach is not anywhere close to what our colleagues in math and science are doing. They have a different approach to this. So yeah, I think it's hard as an institution to square these all of these things, but I think within a discipline, it makes sense to have some coordination. The other thing I see is that, again, there's this kind of novice versus expert kind of level of knowledge, and so when you are working with very fundamental foundational concepts, right, I think it's easy to make a justification for like, look, like the students need to do the hard thing here, they need to work on this. But as they get into more, the higher level work, the higher order thinking, then you can kind of work on more complex interactions with AI. But again, people be like, well, that's a slippery slope, right? And then we open that up and we open up Pandora's box. So, yeah, Jennifer.
Thank you both. This is really helpful. Interesting. That's something I'm thinking a lot about. So I feel I'm totally convinced that some kind of introduction be really helpful, especially in intro level courses. So I'm wondering if both of you could talk a little bit more about the kind of specifics of what that intro module or section is like in your classes. And then I'm also curious what your policy was then for the remainder of the class. Like once you had sort of done all this work to try to get the students on board, did you then say it really is up to you now what you're going to do, or did you have kind of scaffolding or different kinds of policies for different kinds of assignments, etc.?
Yeah. For my module, what I did is I had these distinct kind of little assignments, basically, where I make a case for, doing the hard work of learning in relation to these major themes in our class. And so each day there would be a reading, and then there would be a lesson, and there would be essentially me making a pitch for like, here's the like reason why, here's the way that the Greeks thought about citizenship, right? And so they talk about an active citizen, somebody that's thinking about and engaged with like the life of the polis, right? And so then we would read about, some reading that was connected to that. We talk about it. And I did that for 4 weeks on these different themes. And so it was just kind of constantly reiterating like hard work, hard work, hard work. And again, like as the semester went on, I started out pretty rigid with like, okay, like you're not going to use AI for like any phase of this project. And then as we got further along, by the time they spend the last quarter essentially doing a research seminar. They just write their own individual essay on a topic. I said that, you can't have it actually just like write your essay for you, but you can engage it in like brainstorming and research. I'm a little torn on brainstorming because like you could say that like brainstorming is maybe the place where you do the most creative work, right? But yeah, I opened it up as the end. So we worked from very little incorporation to like more open. And I think as you expand it out, you've got to like be really kind of doing AI literacy, like modeling stuff for them along the way as well. Yeah.
I've got a couple of questions from the online group. Andrea, are you available to unmute?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yay. So I'm interested from an evaluation perspective. A lot of the onus tends to be on the students changing how they're approaching AI or, being more ethically minded when they use AI. How are each of you modifying your approach to assessment of learning to maybe more intentionally align the need for cognitive engagement with the material and skills that you're trying to build? So maybe how are you thinking more creatively about assessment?
Bless.
Now, I have to say that my module is not going to become effective until the fall. So I'm still in the stage, I'm developing it and trying to figure out what the possible outcome will be. But I think that one way to look at it is that in adult learning theory, we stress the importance of sharing with students, sharing the general educational goals that we have and the reasons why we choose a certain path, and clarifying why we made certain choices, and what the expectations are. So an important part of it will be for me to stress the fact that they will not be evaluated on perfection. The writing will not be expected to be absolutely accurate. And so that was true already in the past when we were evaluating our students' writing. But probably they were not completely aware of the extent of it. They thought that we would be pleased to see a perfect piece of writing with absolutely accurate grammar already in the first month of Italian 101. Which of course is not the case. But so I think that more than modifying our grading, making the students aware of the fact that they will be evaluated not on accuracy, because our goal is not strictly an assessment or these writing pieces of writing, but it's to encourage their developmental ability in the language. So I think that clarifying that rather than modifying our grading criteria will be motivational for students to give it a try, to put in the hard work, as Andy said.
Yeah. And I've kind of been more student-centered in my approach for a while now. And so for me, the assessment part was actually the piece that I had fairly well figured out before this came along. My courses are fairly slow and deep in the way that we process stuff. So with assessment, what we do is we do a lot of iterative work on writing. There's a lot of formative assessment, and there's more weight put on the formative spaces of assessment than the summative spaces. And so for me, I felt like it was a fairly easy transition because I'm engaged in these conversations with my students. I literally sit down with a student. I go over every phase or not every phase, but I go over their work with them in person and we have a conversation about it. And so being sure to build in a lot of formative assessment, I think that was something I was doing beforehand, but now I'm even more committed to like the importance of formative assessment. Now, the problem with that is that takes a lot of time, right? So there's our choice that we have to make between do I work on the skills? Do I work on, really being intentional and like helping the students understand that perfection is not the point of this, but like maybe I don't talk about certain topics as much, right? And so that's the trade-off that we have to have there. But I feel very happy with like the formative assessment piece. Yeah.
I just want to get to Kathleen if she's still online and willing to unmute.
I am. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Great. This question is for Laura and Andy. Ethical AI use has come up in both of your presentations as something that clearly means a lot to students. In your specific experiences with them, what has ethical use actually meant in a practical sense? And then what do you think are the limits of our duties as instructors to have them question and define their own ethics of using it in our courses?
The easiest way for students to deal with this concept would be the the aspect of fairness. Ethical is fair, and fair is to have all students evaluated precisely for what they're able to do. So the moment that some of them use AI in a way that is not authorized, then that aspect of fairness is attacked. And that would be an ethical infringement in their eyes too.
Yeah, and I think that's it complicates things for them because they, I think, are very willing and would like to not be in these unethical spaces, but I think because they perceive their peers as constantly like existing in these unethical spaces, that pulls them because of this social pressure. They like, well, gosh, I don't want to fall behind everybody else, right? And so there is, I think, you know, I ask my students at the start of the year, like, what do you think about AI? You know, what do you think about use of the overwhelming majority of my students? And there was just a study from Oxford University. They say, I don't want to use AI. I think there's all of these problematic aspects of AI. Like they're very cognizant, I think very aware of like the ethical implications of that. But again, they're looking over their, you know, they're constantly looking over the shoulders of their classmates. And I hear this from the you know, my undergraduates as well, the pre-service teachers, that they're very aware of the students that do and do not use AI, or at least they assume that they're very aware. I think like, again, that might be another thing to suss out is like, how real is this? But yeah, I think they get pulled into it. The other thing in terms of ethics that they're very cued into, and it ties to this question of fairness, is that they have very high expectations that I, the instructor, if I'm going to make these claims about AI usage, that I therefore do not use it as well. And so they view any usage of AI, really in any way, as hypocrisy. And I've heard this across the board from them. So, you know, you really have to be careful. Like if you're going to take this tone and have these kinds of policies where you have a fairly strict, you know, anti-AI agenda, you need to, you know, practice what you preach, because they are going to really be judging you very harshly, or you need to be really clear about like, look, like, you know, I am an expert. I know how to use these things maybe a little bit better than you. But that might also not necessarily come off the best with the students. They also don't like being like kind of, you know, condescended to in that way. So that's a hard one. Yeah.
Well, we got time for one more question in the room here. If anybody's, yes, please.
Do you use any teaching practice to improve, to emphasize just joy of learning, associate the use of AI, regardless of emphasizing civic or democratic or other things?
Just like, how do I help the students just like develop a love of learning and like,
Because if I'm a high school student, I think when my teacher really helped me enjoy learning, using or without using AI. I think that's very important for me. So I'm just wondering whether you have any practice that you use for doing that.
I think the best way to help a student develop a love of learning is to like practice, find a way to help them connect to it personally, right? Like when you personally connect to an issue, if you have the opportunity to have agency and decision making in your educational process, right? That's a place where like, you know, that really helps students spark that joy, I think. And so for me, I try to build in as much choice into the curriculum as I can within reason. I mean, there's some things where I'm like, no, we need to learn about like, you know, these principles of like democracy, right? Like that's something that I'm not gonna be super flexible on. But, you know, when it comes to like our final unit project, like maybe you can compare these different kinds of democratic systems and do something like that, right? Like you build places of choice and you build opportunities for the students to have agency. I feel like that's a way to really help at a foundational level build that joy of learning. Yeah. But it's also, again, means more work for you, the teacher, to do that. So yeah, it's your choice.
I have a question. This is
maybe for everyone in the room. I think this is kind of meeting is really helpful because every one of us challenged by AI, we use it, we also tell the student not to use it. How can we really continue this conversation? Because I will go back to my department, isolated again with two people who are working on AI. How would this, we need really, maybe by the end of this meetings to have a channel where in my mind, like we used to have model, I think before Canvas, where I can see other people really syllabus.
Yeah.
And I can learn from them. I'm not gonna teach their class, but I can learn from them. Now Canvas is isolating everyone. You're in a box, you think with yourself, and we really don't see each other. Innovation, creative ideas. I don't know how we can really get out of this box.
The idea of sharing syllabi is really an interesting one. And there are tools out there that, I don't know if the campus seriously looks at any of these tools, but there are great tools that publicly make your syllabi available. So students are actually aware of your syllabi as they're shopping for courses. So there's lots of ways to kind of get that information out there. But I do think community building around AI, all we've done so far is a Teams channel, and it's very inactive. No one really feels like chatting in Teams about these things, but it's these personal conversations that are meaningful. And so more sessions like this, I mean, CITL will continue to run talking sessions, I think.
Yeah, at least something like twice a year where we can meet again and see where we are now after this meeting and how we can teach other faculty who are coming as a new faculty or student, our TAs. I think it can be helpful. And I know there is open syllabus online.
Yeah.
There is this repository, but I'm also talking about maybe this is the only solution.
Like more details, I think you're talking about.
Yeah, because there is a lot of update. Like I'm sure you update your syllabus every year. I do update my syllabus, but I'm sure if I get to know everyone working on this part, it's gonna be saving me time.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, well, hopefully one of the outcomes of this is 35 new AI champions on campus that at least have some idea of whether they like AI or don't like AI and are willing to talk to peers about it. So that's definitely one of the goals of this, right, is developing some expertise that can be shared. I think that's it for the online folks. Thank you for being here. I think some camera's looking at me somewhere.
Yeah.
But yep, thank you. And thank you for our presenters. I appreciate it. And for those of you in the room, be back here tomorrow at 10. Yep, thank you so much.